Hello, I wanted to share with you guys why I created a module called OLOO. It is very similar to the You Don't Know JavaScript books. If you're familiar with those, I would highly recommend you check them out. But for the most part, it basically involves not using the classes inside of JavaScript and using the built-in object.create and object.assign functions. If you aren't aware, the way object.assign works right now in JavaScript is it calls, gets, and sets when you use object.assign. So that makes it so that you can't really properly inherit when you use those functions, as well as it's hard to call base functions when you're using these object.create and object.assign. We'll still continue using object.create, but object.assign has many problems. It is very fast though, so if you do need speed with an object, this might not be the best solution for you. It's good enough for thousands of objects, 10,000, but once you get into 100,000 million, you might want to consider a different object if it matters how fast it loads. But once you create it, it shouldn't be a problem. And as far as classes go, classes are annoying because if you're not aware of the this binding with classes, it will make it so that you can't use this dot functions. You have to use this dot function dot bind to whatever this is, so that you can keep a reference to it. And so I'm just going to show you some examples of how the module will work. You basically, this is just what it's called in the module, but you would call it like so. Let me bring this out. You call it like so. You have at LearnGameDevelopment / OLOO. I would use just OLOO if I could. It's already taken, but basically you do that. You call setup. Setup will create a global variable called OLOO, and then you just call create on your first object. This is how you create an object in JavaScript, the basic object. I typically like to use a create function for my objects, so that later on I can call them like so to create it. And then apply variables to that created object so that each object has its own variables. If you put an object over here, it is more of a static variable versus this is more of an instance variable. So as we move down the chain, the second object then does a create as well, but this one does an OLOO assign, creates the first object, and then assigns this second object. So if you're familiar with C#, it would be this syntax instead of this one. Extends, and then you pass this into the second parameter. And so that's C#, you're more familiar. This is the current class, and then it extends from this. Then we keep on going down the chain. We have this object, we have another object that's also inheriting, and then another object that's inheriting, and we keep on going down. And I have these methods that are inheriting each object. So we have the virtual method that will be calling each object. And so if we take this guy, for instance, object 6, and we call virtual method, we expect object 6. If we go up, it'll keep on going upwards, and it'll start with this object 1, object 2, object 3 has no, so it'll go to object 4, object 5, and then object 6. And if we run it, we will see /test. What did I call it? I called it extend. Sorry. All right. And now if we look at it, we'll see that object 6, when it calls here, it is this, and it does object 1, object 2, object 4, object 5, object 6. So it goes down the chain. You can also call the base function. So if you say base, you pass in the object that you want to call the base of, and then you pass in the method. You can pass in the method, or you can also pass it in like so. And then that will make it so that when you run it, you get the base method here. And so this starts with object 5 instead of starting with object 6. And you can see it's very easy to use. Basically, it's a simpler class without like all the magic happening behind the scenes of a typical JavaScript class. And without having to bind to this, you can always just say, you can always get the variables like this dot meme. I called this one meme too. Sorry for the ridiculous naming. I was just testing in this class, but basically I can And this 0 will be a default 0 on every class, but this specific object 2 will have this when it calls it. And we can see that from here, or we can do, let's do a plus plus here so that we can see the difference. So if we add a plus plus, that means that in object 6, we will expect meme to print out 1 here, and then when we call it again, we expect it to print out 2. So this should be, let's just put it 1, and if it should say 1, and this should say 2. Because the meme got incremented each time it got called. All right, now that we have the plus plus inside of the virtual method, we should see all of these objects have 1, and this guy, since it calls it twice, should have 2. And we'll run with the debugger so we can see that. Let's go. So this guy has 2 here. This guy has 1. This guy has 1. This guy has 1. They all keep track of their own instance of the method. And since this guy has this 3, but object 3 is the only one that creates this variable. So this is the only, anyone who inherits from this will have this on its instance, while anyone who inherits this will have these guys. And this is just set to what number it is. This is 3, for example. Then you can see this is object 6. The virtual method 2 times. We can keep on calling it like so. Let's go to debug console. Let's keep calling it. Now if we look at it, it called 7 times. I'm going to check out why this is undefined real quick. And it was just the fact that the return was undefined. So yeah, if we do call this guy, let's get rid of this thing. We call it with virtual method. It'll slowly increment it. That undefined just has to do with the return of the virtual method. And if we look at that, we called it 8 times. Let's call it again. Boom, 9. And so this is just a very easy way, I feel like, to get rid of having to use a bunch of bindings. Let me show you an example of all the bindings I have to do for a class. So we have all these bindings that I have to do. And if I was doing with the object literal, I wouldn't have to do any of these bindings because it would always be bound to the object instance that we created. So yeah, I hope you like the module. I hope it's useful. If you want some help with like syntax highlighting and making sure that you're not making errors when you're creating the object, I also have an extension, this guy right here, JS to TS compiler. It'll help compile down your JavaScript file that is set up as an OLOO. It'll help it compile down to a TypeScript in your typings folder. Down here, let's look at an example. A non-React class like HTML parser. This one is more useful. You'll see it'll parse it correctly. We have tags. It'll parse whatever object the thing returns, or what if you have a return type. So it just makes a TypeScript file based off of what you've put in your documentation, and it'll help with IntelliSense on Visual Studio Code, which is, you don't have to do anything. You just save and it'll create this for you, and it'll give you errors if you messed up with doing OLOO.